What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G and going over whether or not it's still worth buying in 2023. Now, this phone is about 2 years old now, so when it comes to budget smartphones, it's definitely getting up there in age. But that being said, I do think this is still a pretty good phone that does actually have a decent amount of value. So we're going to be going over its specs and features to help you decide whether or not it's still a good phone for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch TFT display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and an 81.6% screen to body ratio. So in general, for what it is, the display really isn't bad. But honestly, in 2023, especially when it comes to Samsung Galaxy A series phones, you honestly can do a lot better. Nowadays, even phones like the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G, for example, are going to have 1080p resolutions instead of 720p, so that is one big drawback of this phone. In addition to this, with a TFT display versus the Super AMOLED you get with something like the Samsung Galaxy A33 5G, the image quality in general is really just not going to be nearly as good. Now, that being said though, at 6.5 inches, the A32 5G is still decently large, which does tend to be a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content. And in addition to this, with a 20:9 aspect ratio, we are getting a taller and more narrow form factor. So if you're doing something in landscape mode, like watching a video for example, you are going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something like reading, browsing the web, using social media, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So in general, although in this day and age you can definitely do better, the display on this phone is still decent. So if you're more of a casual user and you don't need the absolute best and you really just want something that works, this phone will still be at least okay. Now for storage, this phone is getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, but keep in mind, most of the versions you get through a carrier are only going to have 64. But that being said, I don't think carriers really carry this phone anymore. So if you are interested in the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G and you want more storage than 64, just keep in mind that while the 64GB version is more common, the 128GB version like this one is out there. Now that being said, in my opinion, 64GB really isn't enough storage for most people, because with stuff like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger, at this point in 2023, 64GB is going to fill up pretty quickly. But that being said, with 128, I do think this is a lot more ideal. So if you are considering this phone, I would definitely look for the version with more storage. But that being said, if you do somehow wind up with the version of this phone that has 64GB, keep in mind it does have microSD card expansion, so you can always offload stuff like photos and videos. And honestly, if you're a really light user and you're not really doing a ton with your phone, then while again 64GB really isn't ideal, you will at least get by. Now for security features, this phone does have face unlock, as well as a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key. So definitely nice to get both options here, especially considering in 2021 when this phone first came out. In this price range, having both a fingerprint scanner and face unlock was definitely not guaranteed. But that being said, let's go ahead and give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And of course, since again this phone does have face unlock, if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, with the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G, we're getting a 13MP front-facing camera. Then on the back, we got a full quad camera setup with a 48MP main camera, an 8MP ultra-wide camera, a 2MP depth sensing camera, and a 5MP macro camera. So as far as features go, this phone has pretty much everything, including an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera. So if you're taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, this is definitely going to be a good thing. In addition to this, when it comes to the actual photo quality, the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G, despite being a 2-year-old phone by now, still does take really good photos, even compared to phones that are out nowadays. Now keep in mind, this is really an entry-level phone, so the photo quality is not going to be nearly as good as a $1,400 flagship phone, for example, but for a more affordable budget option, for the average user, if you're taking photos maybe to share on social media, for example, it will absolutely get the job done. In addition to this, for video, the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G can record in up to 4K in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. So in general, when it comes to recording 4K videos, this is definitely one of the most, if not the most affordable phone that can do that. And at this point in 2023, honestly, if you're recording a lot of videos, you're probably going to want something that can record in 4K, because the resolution is becoming more and more widely used. So in general, if you're taking a lot of photos and recording a lot of videos, and you want something that has plenty of features, good quality, and can record in 4K, but at the same time, you don't need the absolute top of the line quality, and maybe you don't want to spend $1,400 on a flagship phone, in that kind of situation, the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G will will actually be a really good choice. Now, as far as RAM and processor go, the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G is getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 725G processor. When it comes to the performance, while I don't think this is a slow phone in this market, if performance is really important to you, you can easily find a phone that's quite a bit faster. But that being said, for basic activities like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and maybe some light mobile gaming here and there, the A32 5G will still absolutely get the job done. Now, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on it, and here are the scores I got. What I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone will be an upgrade for you. On one hand, if you're coming from more of a lower end device, there is a good chance it will be, but on the other hand, if you're coming from an older flagship phone like for example maybe a Samsung Galaxy S10, while again this phone definitely is not a slow phone, it's still not going to be nearly at that level. Now for the battery, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery here that supports 15-watt fast charging, so definitely a great battery. This is pretty much the largest battery you can get in the US, so with this phone, you can definitely expect to get great battery life and longevity. So in general, if battery life is important to you, then it's definitely going to be a great option. But that being said, keep in mind, again, this phone is about 2 years old. And if you happen to get it used, while again, this phone does have a great battery that not only has a lot of life per charge, but is also going to get good longevity too. Keep in mind, no matter how good the battery is, all batteries degrade over time. And seeing that this is again pretty old for a smartphone, or at least for a budget phone that is, the battery life might not be quite as good as it was when it was new. But despite this, again, with a 5000 mAh battery, if you do want a phone that has good battery life, in general, I do think this phone will still be a good option. Another thing to keep in mind here is that the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G does have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, you'll be happy to know you can do that with this phone. But in conclusion, is the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G still worth buying in 2023? In general, it really depends on what you're looking for. On one hand, if you're looking for a mid-range 5G phone, then honestly at this point in 2023, I really don't think this phone can actually compete with what's out there. But on the other hand, if you're looking for really more of an entry-level phone, you want decent performance, a great camera setup, an acceptable display, and a large battery, and you really just don't want to spend a whole lot on a phone. In that kind of situation, despite it again being about 2 years old by now, for those of you who are really just looking for an affordable, reliable 5G device, I do think the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G is still worth considering. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.